Chapter 12. Haddad dreamed. He fell through space. With the still air, he could see the clouds rushing up. Then a cloud surrounded him. There was no movement. His hands and feet knocked on wood as he turned. He was in the stasis box. The smoke forced itself down his throat, trying to strangle him. He jumped up and ran. Everything was covered. It was fog, and he ran slower and slower as the chill of it drained the heat from his body. No matter which direction he ran, he was still lost. He began to stumble and trip over uneven ground. Was that water he waded through? The fog was clearing, and now he could see. He was on a battlefield. Torn and mangled bodies stretched toward the horizon, many submerged in bloody pools of stagnant water. They were his comrades he had trained with. He stumbled from corpse to corpse, looking into dead eyes as he tried to find a survivor. Now he found childhood friends, schoolmates from years before, neighbors from his youth, and members of his family. He screamed in grief, and his voice swept everything away. He cried alone on an empty plain. Then someone walked toward him. It was Latula. The artificer stood before him, her arms open wide and a smile on her face. He ran at her, his fists clenched so tightly that blood leaked from them. She showed no fear and waved him on. He struck her, and her arms shattered at the blows. But it was Lord Druick who fell at his feet. The warlord's limbs and face were gone, eaten away by the jelly, so only a torso and head lay writhing. Then Druick was on the table, and Haddad attached new limbs and forced machine parts into the Keldon. Finally, Druick had arms and legs, and Haddad lay weapons at the hands and feet of his creation. Just the head remained to be done, a fleshy skull without eyes. Someone handed him a mask to place over the head. As Haddad screwed the metal to bone, the eyes of the mask opened and stared at him in pain. Haddad awoke. The former League soldier lay on an actual bed. It was narrow and creaked loudly as he tried to raise his head. He finally managed to sit up. Haddad's mouth seemed full of cotton, and he staggered toward the door. A table with a bucket of water on top diverted his path. He checked to make sure it was not the chamber pot and drank using his hand as a cup. Haddad blinked as he considered the room. Light leaked through a shutter and provided a dim illumination. In a corner, his gear lay in a pile, and except for the bed and the table, there was no furniture. A candle sat on the table, and he could see a chamber pot under the bed. For an inn, it seemed inadequate, but for a prison, it was surprisingly comfortable. Haddad tried the door, but as he expected, it was firmly locked. The window opposite the door was not locked, and neither was it barred. Haddad threw the shutters wide and blinked away tears as the light assaulted his eyes. Eventually, his vision cleared, and he looked out over a cluster of buildings. In the distance were bare hills, a low wall of weathered rock hemming in the sky. They were scattered, massive structures of stone and timber. There were no real streets, just beaten paths between buildings, and a road that led off to the hills. The shadows were long and covered the ground under his window. Everything was quiet, and Haddad wondered at the silence. Now he could see warriors and slaves walking between buildings, but the scene seemed nearly deserted. A gust of wind made him shiver, and he grabbed the blanket from the bed as he looked out. Those were women walking, he now thought. The groups were organized around a core of large, richly dressed figures with smaller women orbiting around them. Haddad watched and noticed there were no children visible. In every city he knew, at least a child or two played in the streets or was carried by its mother. He watched a warrior walk below him. The sound of his footsteps was muffled, and he left footprints in the ground that slowly vanished from the thick coating of moss. Haddad was up several stories, and he wondered if he was in a building like the others before him, all high-peaked and very large. Windows for light broke the walls, and on the roofs were skylights and light wells. There were smaller buildings scattered around, and Haddad recognized animal corrals, though few beasts moved within them. Haddad listened carefully and heard the voices of children off to the side. He leaned forward and looked left and down into the corner of a walled compound. The wall enclosed acres, and children played and ran in the open field. Behind them loomed a complex of buildings with figures moving in great numbers. Haddad looked at the children near the wall as a circle formed and a free-for-all erupted. A larger boy moved through the fight, dealing out blows that left youths grasping for air. On the opposite side of the battle, several girls moved as a group, setting upon the fighters who came too close. The fighting died down as the victorious boy slowly circled the girls, and then the children started back toward the complex of buildings. "Perhaps it's a school?" Haddad muttered to himself, and then turned as the door opened behind him. It was a Keldon female. Her gray skin was weathered and her hair was sprinkled with white. She wore a dress of deep blue with several panels of brown leather. Her feet were booted, and a belt with a dagger and wallet completed her wardrobe. She was slighter than Latula, but looked hard. "You're awake, then," she said. "I am Iola, the steward of this house. Please follow me so you may commence your duties." She paused slightly before turning to lead the way from the room. "Now I suggest you hurry and finish dressing." Haddad had woken dressed except for boots, which he found sitting under the bed behind the chamber pot. He jammed his feet into them and patted himself down quickly. He paused. Something was on his left arm. He quickly rolled up his sleeve and discovered a metal band which covered his upper arm. It was a dull bronze, and Latula's sigil circled in a repeating pattern. He tried to locate the catch or seam by which he could remove it, but found nothing. How could he have not noticed it before? It was tight enough that he could not slip a fingernail under its edge. He began to dig into the skin around it when Iola interrupted him. "You can scratch your itch later," she said. "Follow me now." Her voice contained the warning signs that Haddad learned from Latula, and he stood up at once. He stepped quickly to follow her as she proceeded onto the staircase, and he closed the door after him, noting the sigil on the door. It was a stylized rodent, and Haddad wondered if the carving reflected his status in the house. "May I ask a question, my lady?" Haddad knew flattery never hurt. "Where are we?" "You stand on Keld, first among nations," she replied as they walked down the stairs through a series of rooms. Haddad peered uncertainly, and his eyes adapted to the interior lighting. They arrived at a great hall. He looked up and could see the shafts of light from light wells falling into the floors. Metal reflectors threw a spray of light into the corners. Haddad could see a raised dais, but the hall was mainly empty. Haddad and Iola walked along the series of balconies and smaller rooms. "These chambers are for meetings of guests of Latula. Stay out of them, except when on errands," commanded the house steward. "Is Latula important here?" Haddad asked. "Important?" Iola scoffed. "She holds the house. When she was barely out of the cradle house, she expelled the former master and took it for her own." She spoke with obvious pride at what Haddad considered little more than a great theft. "But her travels and work meant the house suffered, so she took me as a second and placed it in my hands." "Is she here now?" Haddad asked, wondering if they were going to report to her. He could see more clearly now, and carvings seemed to jump out of the walls. Every panel, every railing had a design. Haddad thought the wall he passed showed a story rather than just ornamental pattern. "She had business among the great lords and is not expected for quite some time," Iola answered. Then she turned a corner and walked away from the interior hall. The light grew dimmer, and the carvings were less ornate. Iola pointed out the firewood room and other storage areas, and then went down to the next floor. The narrow staircase was black, and Haddad felt his way down the steps as Iola waited impatiently at the bottom. He could feel carving on the railing and the walls as his hand guided him down. He turned a corner, and there was more light. Haddad and Iola were in a kitchen, and he looked at the men and a few women preparing food. The air was hot, and Haddad perspired as he passed the cooking fires. Panting dogs ran in work wheels, turning spits of meat. The cook and the principal workers in the kitchen were women and showed the gray skin of Keldons, while the men were all subject races. Humans, dwarves, elves, and a few races that Haddad could only guess at were stirring pots and making bread. "You have access at all hours and may freely take what you need as long as you do not interfere with the others' duties," Iola continued as she headed toward the pantries. Iola and Haddad passed many slaves, but none were introduced, and all ducked their eyes at their passage. Iola opened the door to the yard and stepped outside. She was walking toward a network of outbuildings almost exactly like the workshops Latula had constructed back on Haddad's home continent. Iola waved for him to stay where he was and yelled for a slave to stop. The man fell to his knees as Iola approached. Haddad turned and looked at the exterior of the house. It was the size of a palace. Haddad would have thought a king or great family lived there, and he wondered how even Latula, strong as she was, had been able to evict the previous tenants. Haddad heard the sound of a blow being landed, but only saw Iola walking toward him as the slave staggered away. Iola continued as if nothing had happened. "You will be working in the farthest workshop, the one next to the cradle house." She waved toward the wall behind which Haddad had watched the children battle. "Is the cradle house a school, then?" Haddad queried. If Latula came from that particular institution, Haddad had no wish to meet the rest of the graduating class. "Of course the cradle house is a school. It is also a hospital and nursery. All Keldons are born and raised in a cradle house." Iola shook her head at his ignorance. "You foreign slaves ask the most bizarre questions." They stopped before the workshop where Haddad would be working. It was a high-peaked structure of at least 2 stories. A staircase ran along the exterior of the building, and Iola started up the steps. Haddad followed, looking into the windows of the first story. He could see little beyond shadows and covered tables. A large lock closed the door at the top of the stairs, and Iola took a ring of keys from her wallet and sorted through them. She extracted one and opened the door. Haddad entered the room first. It was still dim, even with the door open, and Iola proceeded to open the shutters, letting in more light. Haddad noticed that these windows were barred. On the floor lay a collection of crates with Latula's mark, and a series of League technical manuals sat at a nearby table. Iola gestured toward the piled supplies. Latula commands you to reconstruct one of your war machines from the materials provided. She will expect it completed at her return. You will work on it, except when you are resting at the main house. Iola handed him the key to the door. You will be responsible for securing your work. Let no other slave enter, and say nothing about your work. Meals are your own responsibility. And with that, she left. Haddad was alone, free from observation. He locked the door from the inside and stretched with unaccustomed freedom. If he had been given some liberty, he wanted to put it to good use. He began inspecting his work area. There was a plethora of tools that he could use as weapons: chisels, hammers, bar stock, metal shears, and more. He put aside an awl and some wire for construction of weapons. Then, thinking that he might be questioned by Iola, he opened the crates. They did indeed contain parts for a steel ant, several in fact. The problem was that every casing had been pried open and examined. Gears and cabling were missing. Many of the parts showed what must be combat damage. Worse, there were no power stones to move and control the device once it was constructed. Haddad was trained in quick field repairs using modular parts to replace damaged subsystems. Building an ant would be much more difficult than it had first appeared. Haddad rubbed the metal band on his arm as he considered what would be necessary to fulfill his commission from his Keldon masters. His arm itched, and he wondered what it signified. He wondered how long it would itch, and turned back to work with a promise that he would ask about the armband. He emptied the crates and considered how to proceed. It was growing late when Haddad finally prepared to leave. The workshop lacked lamps or candles, and twilight was ruining Haddad's vision. He was starving, and he promised himself that in the future he would bring food and drink with him. He sat at a table looking at his hands and thinking about the next day. His hands were colored with oil and grease from the parts he inspected. As he cleaned them on a cloth, he noticed how the stains had set in quickly and already looked several days old. He was in front of a window facing the cradle house. The rise of the workshop and a dip under the enclosure wall allowed him to look on within the compound. Children were being called inside, and Keldon boys raced each other. Pregnant women rose from chairs and walked into the buildings within the compound. None of the women appeared gray-skinned, and Haddad wondered where the Keldon mothers sat. It wasn't until he was outside that he realized almost the entire day had passed without thoughts of escape. Access to all those tools, and he made no weapons, nor had he appropriated a tool for his private use. All he was carrying was a league manual and some writing supplies. He promised himself that at the very least he'd write down his observations and any information he thought the League might want. His current freedom was an illusion that might end at any time. He must start planning for an escape. Only a few seconds after starting toward Latula's house, he heard the creak of a gate behind him. He turned to see a hidden door opening in the cradle's house enclosure wall. Several figures stepped through before it closed. Even after seeing it open, Haddad was unsure of the gate's position on the unmarked wall. Remembering the respect toward cradle women and midwives demonstrated by the Keldon warriors back in the military colony, Haddad stopped and lowered his head in respect as the party passed. The leader of the party was cloaked, but her companions were not Keldon. The first woman of other races that he had seen close up for longer than he cared to remember. He forgot to duck his head and stared as they passed him, but no answering glance was sent his way. He waited a few seconds and followed them, wondering where they would lead. Iola greeted the party at the door. "Arissa, what a pleasure to see you. Latula will be so upset that she's missed you." The steward fairly fawned over the unexpected guest. Arissa uncloaked and threw her outerwear to one of the women accompanying her. She was shorter than anyone else in the party, and heavy. Time seemed to have compressed her to a stump compared to her taller companions. "I doubt that very much. Plans are not going well, and Latula and her supporters are a source of constant disappointment," Arissa said. She and Iola walked toward one of the rooms that Haddad had been forbidden from entering. He followed the rest of the group, holding the manual up as if in explanation to anyone who might question him. "Latula knows that the invasion is necessary, Arissa," Iola said. "It's just forcing the members of the ruling council to acknowledge that fact. There are other clans and houses fighting to bring down the League after all." "But the bulk of them stay here, waste their time sailing and raiding for mere booty," Arissa spat. "Pursuing folly while our heritage and eventual victory is stolen by by the Kapamu League. Even the woman you have captured from that country has not reversed the birthing trends." The human woman accompanying the two Keldons stopped and seated themselves on the furniture and chairs while their principal withdrew into a farther room. Haddad cursed the luck and took a seat as well. In response to their questioning looks, he brandished the manual and bared his arm with its metal band. The women only shrugged and began dividing up the foods on the table. At the sight of the bread and dried fruit, Haddad's stomach loudly announced its currently empty state. One of the women smiled and offered a plate to Haddad. He took it as an invitation for conversation, even as he grabbed several slices of dried apple. There were 4 women regarding Haddad. 2 of them were blonde. One was very muscular, her neck and forearms sharply defined. Her eyes were dark blue, but hard as she stared at him. Her blonde companion was slender and her features almost ethereal. Her ears appeared somewhat pointed under her hair. Haddad wondered if she had elf blood. "So, what is life like in the Cradle House?" he asked. The women looked at each other while considering their answers. The other 2 shifted their seats to face Haddad more fully. One woman was dark-haired, and her eyes were green. Her face was odd to Haddad. The skin was tight against her skull as if blown back by a wind. Her mouth seemed small, but her teeth were sharp and perhaps filed. The final woman was dark, perhaps from the southern kingdoms in Jamuraa. Her hair was tightly braided against her skull, and intricate networks of scars framed her face, drawing Haddad's gaze to her brown eyes. "It's good enough for some," the brunette replied through sharp teeth, "once they adapt to certain realities." All the women nodded in agreement. Haddad looked at them. All were in good health, on the backside of 30, and all of them exuded confidence and power. Any of them should have appealed to his senses, but he felt numbed by their presence. "What realities are we speaking of?" he asked. The response was stunning. "The hardest for some is giving up their children. Even though they know the babies will receive good care, some can't overcome their feelings. No matter how firmly one tries, some breeders won't adjust," the muscular blonde explained. Haddad wondered what sort of people considered loss of a child something to ignore. "One woman from down south who shares your coloring," the brunette interjected, "wouldn't stop crying after her first child went into the nursery, even though there was a good chance that it might become a war leader. And at least hers didn't die like so many others have done of late," the slender blonde added. Something about this comment set the others staring at her. Haddad now saw the woman as they saw themselves, hard and indifferent. They had closed off their empathy and been rewarded with positions of authority inside the Cradle House. Haddad heard the Keldon women returning, and he withdrew as the others stood. He went to his room to consider what he had learned. That night, he wrote notes regarding all his experiences and what he had observed. He dared not keep it in his room and decided that he would hide it somewhere in Latilla's workshop, where it was unlikely to be discovered. He blew out the candle and went to sleep. Haddad dreamed. He was inside the walls of the Cradle House, and instead of buildings, there was only a small basket in the middle of the yard. The women he had met stood at either side, and a long line of new mothers stretched out into the distance. As the line moved forward, each baby was ripped away and thrown down into the wicker container. As each child disappeared, the basket swelled and grew until the women were throwing children high into the air. Each was gulped down, and then something broke out of the Cradle House and fell upon every living thing. Dawn woke Haddad, and he rose from bed with a will. He stuffed the papers that he worked on the night before into his wallet. Best to get to the workshop as early as possible and let Iola find him toiling away like a good little slave. This time he thought to stop by the kitchen after freshening up. The baker and her assistants were just putting out the bread from the pre-dawn baking, and Haddad snared a loaf. He ignored the baker's indignant utterance and snatched a sack of ale that he spotted lying unattended. He stepped outside into the crisp air. Despite a touch of frost, Haddad found he was warm in the clothes he had selected from his gear. If the workshop was too cold, he would check the small stove to see if he could start a fire. He remembered that a load of wood was stacked on the side. The door opened easily to the workshop, and he locked it behind him. Hours passed as he worked on the parts for the steel ant. Perhaps by cannibalizing several machines, he would be able to create a fighter for himself. He certainly would trust the loyalty of a mechanical construct over the other house slaves. Haddad remembered the advice 2 nameless men had provided him: seek to escape and trust no one. He lost himself in sorting through a box of gears, looking for a replacement he could use in a leg assembly. The day passed quickly with no interruptions. Haddad considered the assembly project against the parts he had available. He could finish it if only he had enough time. The most difficult part would be closing and filling the modular sections that were picked apart. The League machine was near perfect in its performance, but it depended on a high-quality control of the sealed modules. A steel ant might go months without maintenance, barring battle damage. If he could contrive some plan of escape, the ant might be the key. In addition, just completing the repair would boost his confidence at a time when he needed some small victory. He wasn't even sure where Keld was, much less how he would get home. Finding the information he needed would take time. He grew increasingly drowsy as he tried to plan his escape. Who could he talk to? How to keep from raising suspicions? Who to bribe? And how? All questions that needed to be answered, and soon. He rested his head against his arm, the metal armband cool and soothing against his skin. When he awoke, it was growing dark. He didn't know how he could have dozed off. Perhaps the ale he had drunk was far stronger than he realized. He thought no one had checked up on him the night before, but he couldn't be sure. It was possible that he had already missed the bed check or closing of the house doors. He needed to get back to his room. He reached into his wallet for the shop key and found the notes he had written still inside. Carrying them back to the house seemed incredibly foolhardy to him now. He needed a place to hide them. But while he had identified which cabinets and tool chests saw frequent use, there's no guarantee if he hid the papers in one seldom used they might not be discovered. He needed a hiding place where no one would look. Haddad fell to the floor looking for a loose board, a crack under a table, any place to hide the incriminating words. He was back among strange tools and books he could not read when he found what he was looking for. His hand brushed a board, and it rocked. He gripped it. To his surprise, it lifted completely free. The gap it left was approximately 6 inches by 18 inches. Haddad wondered what purpose the cutout had served. The pattern of rust and signs of brackets told Haddad that a tank had been removed in the past. The cutout must have allowed hoses to carry liquid up and down from the floor below. On his knees, he peered through the hole. There was a small ledge along the wall, but it was almost impossible to see anything in the floor below. Haddad thought a moment, then walked to his toolkit. Yes, there were several metallic mirrors for examining inside war machines. He selected the largest and maneuvered it, scanning the space below. The second floor was reinforced with extra-large beams. There was a gap between a beam and the floor plank right by the cutout. The removal of the tank had allowed the flooring to rise. Haddad could just shove the papers into the gap. Let someone to try find him now, he thought. It was the creak of an opening door that made him freeze. He could not conceive of a more suspicious situation to be caught in. He breathed a sigh of relief as he realized the noise was coming from the first story. He heard the sound of rustling fabric. "Make sure the curtains completely seal the windows," whispered a voice. Haddad could make out light footfalls as someone complied. "They're all closed, Orissa." The voice was the high piping of a child, and Haddad wondered what was going on. He was sure that it would be suicidal to call down and ask. A candle was lit, and Orissa and a young Keldon boy were revealed in the mirror. A cloak covered the woman. She leaned against a crate as the boy hurried through the room, closing shutters and pulling curtains. His figure went in and out of Haddad's field of view as the League technician remained frozen, staring in the mirror. "Now, Greel," Orissa said, "let us talk of your journey south to Jamuraa." The child seemed petulant as he kicked at the floor with his heel. He appeared a sturdy boy of 8 in well-made clothes. Perhaps he's family, Haddad thought. Wonder why they're talking here. "I don't know why I need to head south," Greel groused. "I'm happy here. There'll be no children for me to play with. Surely Latilla needs no watcher over her." Orissa punched him sharply, her rings tearing flesh. No blood seeped forth, and Haddad watched the gashes begin to close, hoping that it was a trick of the candlelight, but knowing it wasn't as the flesh healed. "Latilla's plan for reviving the Witch Kings will fail, but she will command in the south. Even with all the aid and spells I provided her, I still don't trust our grip. If she were tied to the altar, I would treat it as an ambush," she hissed. Orissa took a deep breath and looked at Greel. "It's time to put your childhood behind you. You will find new playmates among the League and our less fervent supporters. Now I have a treat for you." Orissa opened her cloak and revealed a sleeping babe in a sling. She unstrapped the child and laid it down. What in the 9 hells is she doing? Haddad wondered. He knew something was dreadfully wrong, and as he watched, Greel struck. The boy, or whatever it was, leaped up and balanced on the side of the crate. It inhaled and then crouched down, its mouth open wide as it began to exhale. Wider and wider the jaws opened, like a snake swallowing an egg. Haddad tried to move, but couldn't. Greel was a nexus of despair and death, and he drained every bit of Haddad's energy. The candle seemed to dim and flicker as if going out. Orissa seemed unaffected, and she moved, blocking Haddad's view of what was going on. The workshop seemed colder and colder. Haddad's armband bit into his flesh as it began to frost. Would his body be discovered in the morning? Hadad wondered. Then the cold began to abate, and the room returned to normal temperature. The creature seemed a boy once more, panting as if race had just ended. He was larger now, and his features were more mature, more rugged. Greel stretched, and his mouth gaped wide as he breathed. The babe was still, and Hadad knew it wasn't sleeping. "I will need more sustenance, Orisa," Greel said as he wiped his brow. His voice was deeper now. "We need to find an eating place within the cradle house. I'll be a warrior size soon." "The curse of the final days is upon us," Orisa laughed. "A few more dead children will surprise no one." She moved to the window and blew out the candles. Hadad heard the curtains being opened, then the creak of a door. Who could he tell? A slave's word against a cradle mistress's? Any hint of what he had seen would mean his death. He knelt on the floor for a long time before he replaced the cutout and found his way out of the room.